Hello all, welcome to Module 2. In this module, we quickly go over the historical and philosophical underpinnings. How did we get to the belief of tourism being able to preserve nature, and also just the value of nature in and of itself? And then also we talk really quickly about the ecological perspective. You'll have two assignments due. You'll see one is a discussion based on the tragedy of the commons, and then the other one is looking into an ecosystem of your choice, talking about in what category of the conservation unit it fits, as well as using some of the terminology you learned in your ecology lecture, such as keystone species and all of that, and applying that. Okay, so let's dive right into it. So in terms of the ecology, the first thing we talk about is ecosystems. You'll see that I post several ecosystems, such as the coral reef, rainforest, and of course we need to know those ecosystems, the species and the plants that live in them, so that we can actually figure out what they need, and then link that to tourism to see how are we impacting these ecosystems and the species that live in them. And for that reason, I also post some of the terminology so we can actually understand what's happening, right? So you'll see that I talk about habitat. What is the habitat? It's basically the physical environment. I talk about, an individual, the biome, the biosphere, all of that. You'll see that we talk about the niche that a certain species actually occupies in a certain ecosystem. So that has to do with where they're in the food chain, how they compete for resources, that kind of thing. We talk about certain things, and I really want you guys to take a look at that, such as living and non-living organisms, biotic and abiotic things, so to speak. We talk about that in the biotic, the living things in an ecosystem. We have autotroph ecosystem members, so to speak, that basically can create their own source of energy. And then we have heterotrophs that actually have to consume other organisms, hence we have food chains, right, in order to get energy. And so we talk about that. We also talk about certain ways organisms are actually interacting with each other. So we talk about symbiosis, we talk about parasites or mutualism, right? So look at all of those. And then lastly, we also talk about keystone species, what they are. So those are species that actually, when you change them or take them out, they impact the whole ecosystem. Okay, so just look at all of those terms, understand them, know what they are, so that we can apply that then to tourism. Okay. In terms of the coral reef ecosystem, I talk really quickly just about, some of the impact factors. So for example, if we apply all of that learned, we talk about that the ecosystem, obviously some of the living, the biotic things are coral, they're the algae, the fish, right? But the abiotic things that are in the coral reef ecosystem, we need sunlight, right? And so there already we have a huge factor, because one of the biggest impacts from tourism is actually through tourism development on land, right? So when we develop resorts, hotels, whatever it is on land, it leads to sedimentation. Sedimentation then ends up in the ocean, and the clear water that coral needs is no longer there, right? Because it's just full of debris and sediments. So that's just one example. So these are the kinds of things that I want you guys to think about in your assignment. When you pick an ecosystem, think about what are the factors that will be influenced, the species, the factors, biotic or abiotic, of the ecosystem that will be influenced, okay? Now for the second part of this module, this is in the page that says historical underpinnings. So in this paper, I really go over, who are the people and what are the laws that we created, and the ideas that we had, the philosophies that we had, that led to us really believing that nature is actually something that is needs to be conserved, that is worthy to be conserved, right? Even if we're not using it for, let's just say, resource extraction or deforestation, those kinds of things, right? So there's something about nature that is worthy to be preserving. And some of those influential pioneers, as I will call them, we talk about in this lecture, right? So one of the first ones that maybe you guys have heard about is Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote a famous essay called Nature. I posted a video about the main principles about nature, but in this he really argued to get away from this idea that nature should only be kind of used to make money from it, and that nature is worthwhile in and of itself to be preserved. And that really is a key idea, and is an idea that was then taken further. Another person we talk about is Frederick Law Olmsted. Anybody been to New York City and to Central Park? So he was actually the landscape architect, the designer behind Central Park. So he's very famous for that. But Olmsted, on top of that, wrote many essays, many writings that really influenced the legislature later in California, as well as, like countrywide legislature, that then led to the creation of actually preserved areas and national parks. And so he was very, very influential, and he was one of the first people that actually said, well, wait a minute, we can use nature, but also allow people to enjoy it. And so two of the laws that I talk about in this lecture, in this module, one is the National Park Service. So the National Park Service was actually established with this whole idea of actually protecting the environment while simultaneously also allowing for the enjoyment of people. So it's a dual thing, right? And we talk about this double-edged sword. So this is the first time that actually we could use tourism as a tool for preservation and also allow nature to be preserved while also opening it up. And so the first national parks, I posted a video there. Watch that. Look who the first national park was. The idea behind it, it's actually really amazing of how that was developed, right? The other jurisdiction, the other law that I talk about is the Coastal Management Act. And that was later done to basically protect our coastal zones, because as I just mentioned in terms of the coral reefs, so much of what we do on land impacts our coastal areas. So just establishing a marine protected area a lot of times is not enough. So what we do is we have this legislation that actually looks at what's happening on land as well, so that we can preserve more our coastal areas. Okay, so that's that. The other one that I mentioned there is the Wilderness Act, and that's actually a pretty cool legislation. It ensures that we can set aside lands, Congress can set aside lands that are just preserved and not be developed. So imagine, even national parks, while they serve to preserve, they are still being developed. So we have, toilets, we have even hotels in there, we have visitor centers. A wilderness area is just that. There is no developed there. It's just wilderness. So imagine the difference. And how great is it that we have legislation that actually allows us to set aside areas such as that. So that's really pretty cool. Okay, so we have Law Olmsted, we talked about Emerson, and then the third really main thing, there's some other people I talk about that I really want to talk about in this video, is the Tragedy of the Commons. The Tragedy of the Commons was developed by Garrett Hardin, and the idea behind the Tragedy of the Commons is that when we have common pool resources, any kind of resource that can be used by anybody, so think about air, oceans, those kinds of things, right? We tend to overuse them. And why do we tend to overuse them? Garrett said it's pretty easy, because everybody benefits by exploiting that resource. And yet, when there's actually a negative impact, those negative impacts are also divided by everybody. So it's not that bad for one individual, right? And so that thinking of the Tragedy of the Commons, he first noticed that with a cow pasture, and that's a really good example. So think about a cow pasture that's divided by just several, let's say, farmers, right? So everybody puts like 1 cow, 2 cow, 3 cow. There's 4 or 5 farmers. They each put a cow, and they each put another cow and another cow, because adding another cow is going to help that individual farmer to make more money, more milk, whatever it is, right? Sell more meat. And yet there comes a point when one farmer adds 1 more cow, and all of a sudden that pasture turns to great brown, right? There's no more grass. And why is that? Because it just has reached its carrying capacity. And so that's basically the Tragedy of the Commons in a nutshell. So the thing is, how can we stop that, right? And we talk about that there's a couple of things we can do. So in your assignment, I, ask you guys to describe the Tragedy of the Commons. I also ask you guys to explain the Tragedy of the Commons in tourism. So what is one example where the downfall of tourism, or maybe a part of over tourism, can be explained through the tragedy of the commons. And then lastly, I want you guys to look at climate change as sort of a good example of tragedy of the commons. And I want you guys to look at some of the solutions for the tragedy of the commons, right? So one of them is agreements, one of them is political, right? Some kind of political interference. Property, whose property is the property ownership, right? So look at those in the lecture and then figure out for your particular assignment and the tragedy of the commons that you picked in your tourism example, what would be a good solution? Which ones of those would be a good solution, okay? And then for the third part, for the climate change, just answer those questions. So I hope this helped you guys. I see you guys next module. Ciao, ciao.